Welcome to my channel. I'm Ben. Today, we step into a chilling crime of jealousy and obsession. A young man full of promise struck down in the dead of night. His life ended by a collision that raised more questions than answers. Was it a tragic accident? Or was someone determined to make sure he never saw another sunrise? It was just after midnight in Greenwood, South Carolina, when the quiet of a country road was shattered by a chilling discovery. A mangled BMW sat at an odd angle, its front end crushed, glass scattered across the asphalt. A few feet away, lying motionless on the cold pavement, was 46-year-old Davis McClendon. His shoes were missing, one found yards from his body, the other tossed aside like debris in a storm. A trail of oil and fluid trickled along the road, leading investigators' eyes into the darkness, hinting at a story far bigger than a tragic car accident. To the first responders, it looked like a possible hit and run, but as they examined the scene more carefully, unsettling details began to emerge. Davis had not been in his vehicle when he was struck. The position of his body, the condition of the wrecked BMW, and the eerie trail of fluid stretching down the road all suggested something more sinister than chance. What was he doing on that stretch of road? Who had been with him? And why did this collision feel less like misfortune and more like intent? Davis was not just another young man. He was a bright soul known for his kindness, his laughter, and his devotion to his friends and family. He had recently found love with a woman named Meredith Haney, a new chapter in his life that seemed to bring him joy. But Meredith's life carried shadows of its own. She was the estranged wife of a man named William Bud Ackerman, whose anger and bitterness had not faded with separation. On that night, in May, 3 lives intersected on a dark South Carolina road, one ending in violence, another unraveling under suspicion, and a third caught between grief and fear. What began as a tragic scene of twisted metal and shattered glass would soon unravel into a case of obsession, betrayal, and cold-blooded murder hidden beneath the guise of an accident. To understand the tragedy of that May night, we must first understand who Davis McClendon was. Born and raised in South Carolina, Davis carried with him the spirit of small-town America: hard work, humility, and a sense of loyalty to those he loved. Friends described him as someone who could light up a room simply by walking in. He had an easy laugh, the kind that instantly disarmed tension, and a way of making people feel seen and valued. At 46-year-old, Davis was at a turning point in his life. He had endured challenges, like many young men do, but he was emerging stronger and more determined. His career was beginning to take shape. His friendships were solid, and perhaps most importantly, he had found love. That love came in the form of Meredith Haney, a woman who had her own complicated past. But to Davis, Meredith was not defined by her struggles. She was a source of joy, someone he cherished, someone he envisioned a future with. Their relationship was new, yet it carried the spark of possibility. Friends noticed how Davis seemed happier, steadier, when Meredith was around. He spoke openly about building a life with her, about the adventures they might share. For a young man who valued connection and sincerity, Meredith represented hope. But as is often the case in true crime stories, that hope existed in the shadow of someone else's pain. Meredith was estranged from her husband, William Bud Ackerman, a man whose reputation in Greenwood was a mix of respect and volatility. Bud was well known in the community, a man who had built his life around work and family. Yet beneath the surface, he struggled with anger and resentment, emotions that only deepened when his marriage began to fall apart. For Davis, the situation was a delicate balance. He wanted to love Meredith openly, but he also knew that her past with Bud was far from resolved. It was a reality that carried unspoken risks Davis may not have fully realized. What seemed to him like a fresh chapter in life may have been viewed by someone else as betrayal, as provocation, as an intolerable insult. The night Davis died, he stood at the center of this collision of lives. A young man seeking happiness, a woman trying to move forward, and a husband unwilling to let go. To the world, Davis was simply a victim of a violent collision. But to those who knew him, he was far more. A loyal son, a beloved friend, and a man whose laughter still echoes in their memories. His character, the warmth, the optimism, the sincerity, is what makes his death not only tragic, but haunting. Because when someone like Davis is torn from the world, we are left to ask, how could a life so full of promise end in such senseless brutality? The evening of May 7th, 2023, began like any other spring night in Greenwood, South Carolina. For Davis McClendon, it should have been unremarkable a drive, a quiet conversation, the warmth of being in love. Yet within hours, it would end in a tragedy that would send shockwaves through his family, his community, and eventually the entire nation, once the details became clear. Investigators pieced together the timeline carefully. Davis had been with his girlfriend, Meredith Haney, that evening. They had spoken about their future, about the simple joys they wanted to share. For Davis, it was an affirmation of everything he had been working toward. But when the night grew late and the country road grew dark, events took a deadly turn. Sometime after midnight, neighbors living along a rural stretch of road awoke to the sound of a crash. When they peered outside, they saw the wreckage of a BMW pushed awkwardly off the road, its front end mangled. The headlights flickered, casting eerie shadows over the pavement. But it wasn't the car that held their gaze. It was the still body of a young man lying nearby. Davis was found shoeless, his clothes torn, his body lying several feet from the destroyed vehicle. One of his shoes was discovered more than 20 feet away, a grim marker of the violence of the impact. A trail of oil and fluid snaked along the asphalt, stretching far from the car into the night. It was this strange trail that first made officers pause. Hit and runs are messy, but this looked different. It was as though the collision had been only one piece of something more deliberate. When law enforcement arrived, they initially considered the possibility of a single vehicle accident. Perhaps Davis had lost control. Perhaps he had stepped out of the car after a breakdown. But soon that theory collapsed. The evidence didn't fit. Davis hadn't been inside the BMW when the collision occurred. The trajectory of the damage, the placement of the body, and the scattered debris all pointed to a horrifying conclusion. He had been struck outside of his car. This changed everything. No longer was this the scene of a tragic accident, it was the scene of a homicide. Someone had run Davis down, and the evidence, chilling in its clarity, suggested intent. As investigators widened their search, they noticed the line of leaked fluid stretching down the road. It was like a breadcrumb trail leading away from the scene. Following it carefully, they traced the line all the way to a house belonging to William Bud Ackerman, the estranged husband of Meredith Haney. The implication was immediate and heavy. Bud had motive. His marriage to Meredith was fractured. His resentment toward her was well known, and Davis had become the visible symbol of her moving on. Now, with Davis lying dead and a physical trail leading to Bud's property, suspicion hardened into near certainty. Neighbors told police about hearing a loud engine earlier in the night, the kind of sound a large truck makes when accelerating hard. Some remembered seeing the headlights of a heavy vehicle barreling down the road not long before the crash was discovered. To them, it hadn't sounded like an accident. It had sounded like pursuit. What haunted the investigators most was the brutality of it all. This wasn't a quick collision at an intersection. This was a young man forced from his car, struck down on the side of a quiet road, his body left broken on the asphalt. The sheer violence of the impact, the way his belongings were scattered, suggested rage, not miscalculation. Forensic teams documented everything: the shattered glass, the dents in the BMW, the trail of fluids, the marks on the pavement. Slowly, the picture came into focus. Davis hadn't been killed by chance. He had been hunted. The news spread quickly through Greenwood. A beloved son, a friend, a man who had simply been trying to move forward with his life, was gone. The whispers began almost immediately. Had Bud Ackerman finally snapped? Was this the tragic collision of love, jealousy, and vengeance? The crime scene left more questions than answers, but one fact was certain. Davis McClendon had been the victim of more than just a hit and run. He had been the victim of a calculated act of violence. And as the sun rose over South Carolina that morning, detectives knew they were no longer investigating an accident. They were investigating a murder. From the moment investigators followed that strange trail of leaking fluid to the property of William Bud Ackerman, the case began to shift from suspicion to certainty. The evidence was no longer scattered fragments. It was a line pointing directly to a man with motive, opportunity, and anger simmering just below the surface. Detectives secured Bud's property and examined the vehicle he owned, a Ford F-250, a massive truck built for power. The exterior bore marks that caught their attention. There were scratches, dents, and subtle but telling signs of recent impact. But the most damning evidence wasn't visible from the outside. It was hidden in the truck's infotainment system, the onboard computer that records speed, acceleration, braking, and even location. When forensic experts accessed the data, the results were chilling. The truck system showed sudden bursts of acceleration, reaching speeds that matched witness accounts of a roaring engine in the night. It also revealed precise moments of braking and impact, all coinciding with the time Davis was struck. It was as though the truck itself was telling the story, a story that made it clear Davis hadn't been killed by accident. He had been hunted down. Meanwhile, investigators turned to the human side of the case. They interviewed Meredith Haney, who was devastated by Davis's death. She spoke of the happiness they had shared, the life they had begun to imagine together. But she also admitted something darker. Her estranged husband, Bud, had never accepted their separation. He was bitter, angry, and unpredictable. To him, Davis represented not just the loss of his marriage, but humiliation. Neighbors reinforced this image. They recalled arguments between Bud and Meredith, heated confrontations that had left scars long before Davis came into her life. Some described Bud as controlling, others as deeply insecure. The picture that emerged was of a man consumed by jealousy, unwilling to let go of what he believed was rightfully his. The trail of evidence grew longer. Witnesses reported seeing Bud's truck that night, heading in the direction of the crash site. Some even remembered the distinct sound of his engine. The timeline, the fluid trail, the computer data all converged. Investigators no longer saw Bud Ackerman as a grieving husband or a bystander to tragedy. They saw him as the prime suspect in a murder disguised as an accident. Within weeks, prosecutors brought charges. Bud Ackerman was arrested and formally indicted for the murder of Davis McClendon. The indictment painted a chilling picture. This was not negligence, not reckless driving, but a deliberate act fueled by rage and jealousy. It alleged that Bud had tracked Davis down, confronted him, and used his truck as a weapon. The arrest shook Greenwood. For many, Bud had been a familiar figure, someone respected in certain circles. To see him in handcuffs was to see the mask ripped away, exposing the darkness beneath. The community's grief for Davis mixed with outrage, a demand for justice not only for a young life cut short, but for the brutal way it had been taken. Law enforcement emphasized that this case was about more than a hit and run. It was about control, power, and the deadly consequences of obsession. They had gathered the evidence, but the courtroom would be where it was tested. For the family of Davis McClendon, the charges were a first step toward closure, though nothing could ever replace the laughter and light that Davis had brought into their lives. When William Bud Ackerman finally faced trial for the death of Davis McClendon, The courtroom in Greenwood, South Carolina, was heavy with tension. On one side sat the grieving family of Davis, their faces etched with pain but determined to see justice done. On the other side sat Bud, a man once respected in the community, now accused of turning his anger and jealousy into murder. The stakes could not have been higher. From the opening statements, the prosecution made its narrative clear. This was not an accident. This was an intentional act carried out by a man consumed by rage. They presented Bud's Ford F-250 not just as a truck, but as the murder weapon. The jury was told they would hear how the vehicle's own computer recorded bursts of acceleration, sudden braking, and data points that aligned perfectly with the timeline of Davis's death. Prosecutors emphasized motive. Bud's marriage to Meredith Haney was crumbling, and Davis had become the symbol of her moving forward. To Bud, it was an unbearable humiliation. Witnesses were brought in to testify about Bud's temper, his inability to accept the separation, and his resentment toward Davis. A chilling portrait emerged, a man who saw his wife's new partner not as another human being, but as an obstacle to be eliminated. The defense countered with a different story. They argued that the incident was a tragic accident, a case of being in the wrong place at the wrong time. They suggested that Bud had no intention of killing Davis, that the collision was the result of poor visibility on a dark road and a sudden, unfortunate set of circumstances. They highlighted Bud's ties to the community, his lack of a prior violent record, and his insistence that he never meant harm, but the evidence was unrelenting. Jurors saw photographs of the wrecked BMW, the scattered belongings of Davis, and the haunting trail of fluid leading directly to Bud's home. They heard testimony from forensic experts who decoded the truck's data and confirmed that its patterns did not match those of an accidental crash. They listened to neighbors who recalled the sound of a roaring engine and the sight of a heavy truck speeding into the night. Perhaps most powerful was the testimony from Meredith Haney. With trembling voice, she recounted the fear she had lived with during her marriage to Bud, his refusal to let go, and the happiness she had begun to find with Davis. Her words were both a tribute to the man she loved and an indictment of the man accused of killing him. Closing arguments brought the tension to its peak. The prosecution urged the jury to see through the defense's claims and recognize the clear pattern of jealousy turned deadly. They framed Bud's truck as not just a vehicle, but as a weapon wielded with intent. The defense in turn pleaded for doubt, reminding the jury that accidents, however tragic, do happen. When the jury retired to deliberate, the courtroom held its breath. But it didn't take long. In less than 30 minutes, they returned with a verdict: guilty of murder. The sentence was swift and severe. Bud Ackerman was ordered to serve 45 years to life in prison, with no chance of early release. For the McClendon family, the verdict was both a relief and a sorrow. Justice had been served, but it could never bring Davis back. The trial laid bare not only the facts of a brutal crime, but also the devastating consequences of unchecked obsession and rage. In the eyes of the jury, Bud had crossed a line from husband and neighbor to murderer, and the community of Greenwood was left to reckon with how such violence could emerge from its midst. The case of William Bud Ackerman forces us to confront one of the most unsettling aspects of human psychology: how jealousy and loss of control can transform into lethal violence. On the surface, Bud was an ordinary man respected by some, known to many in Greenwood, South Carolina. Yet beneath the exterior was a storm of insecurity, anger, and obsession that finally erupted on that dark May night. At the heart of this tragedy lies the psychology of possession. For Bud, his marriage to Meredith Haney was not merely a partnership. It was an extension of his identity. When Meredith began to pull away, Bud didn't see it as the natural dissolution of a relationship. He saw it as betrayal, as theft of what he believed belonged to him. Psychologists often refer to this as pathological ownership, where a spouse or partner is viewed not as an independent person, but as property. This mindset fuels dangerous emotions, and in Bud's case, it became combustible. Jealousy, too, played a powerful role. In normal circumstances, jealousy is a fleeting feeling, tempered by logic and self-control. But in Bud's mind, jealousy metastasized into obsession. He fixated on Davis McClendon as the symbol of his humiliation. Each moment Meredith spent with Davis deepened Bud's sense of powerlessness. Instead of confronting his emotions with introspection or seeking help, Bud externalized them, directing his rage at the man he saw as the intruder. The truck itself became an extension of this psychology. Large, powerful, and unyielding, it embodied Bud's desire to reassert control. Psychologists might interpret his decision to weaponize the vehicle as an act of displacement. Unable to control Meredith, he sought control in the most brutal way possible by dominating Davis through force. The acceleration, the impact, the violence of the act reflected a psyche that equated power with destruction. Control is another key theme. Bud's history of arguments with Meredith, his refusal to let go of the marriage, and his escalating anger all suggest a man desperate to control a situation slipping away from him. For men like Bud, losing control over a relationship can feel like losing control over life itself. This distorted thinking often leads to the dangerous belief that regaining control, no matter how violent, will restore dignity. Instead, it destroys everything. There is also a broader psychological lesson. Cases like this reveal how emotions, when left unchecked, can spiral into catastrophic consequences. Anger, jealousy, and obsession are natural human experiences, but when they dominate thought and behavior, they can eclipse morality and reason. Bud's inability to regulate these emotions, combined with a rigid worldview of ownership and entitlement, turned him into a murderer. For Davis's family and Meredith, the tragedy illustrates the devastating impact of such psychology on innocent lives. Davis became collateral in a battle that was never his to fight. Meredith lost not only the man she loved, but also the remnants of her past, scarred forever by violence. And the Greenwood community was left to grapple with how someone they thought they knew could harbor such darkness. Ultimately, the psychological profile of Bud Ackerman is not just about jealousy or rage. It is about the human capacity for self-deception. He convinced himself that his actions were justified, that his pain demanded retribution. But as the court made clear, and as psychology affirms, such justifications are illusions. What remains is the stark reality of a man who let his emotions consume him, destroying lives in the process. The verdict in the trial of William Bud Ackerman brought a measure of justice, but it could never erase the scars left by the crime. For the McClendon family, every day without Davis was a reminder of the life that had been stolen from them. His laughter, his ambitions, his kindness, all cut short in a single act of violence. Even as Bud was led away in shackles, the emptiness at their dinner table remained. For Meredith Haney, the aftermath was particularly painful. She carried not only the grief of losing Davis, but also the guilt of knowing that her fractured marriage had spiraled into deadly obsession. Though she was never to blame for Bud's choices, survivors of such tragedies often wrestle with questions that have no answers. Could something have been done differently? Could the outcome have been changed? Her testimony had helped secure justice, but healing would take far longer. The Greenwood community reacted with shock and outrage. This was not a crime committed by a stranger passing through town. It was carried out by one of their own. The realization that beneath the surface of familiarity, someone could harbor such darkness left neighbors shaken. Churches held vigils, students at local schools organized memorials, and social media filled with tributes to Davis, a young man remembered for his warmth and potential. Nationally, the case drew attention for its chilling details. A truck weaponized as an instrument of murder, a love triangle turned deadly, and the digital fingerprints left behind by technology all combined into a story that was both modern and timeless. It became a cautionary tale about jealousy, entitlement, and the dangers of unchecked obsession. In the years since, advocates for victims of domestic violence and relationship abuse have pointed to Davis's case as an example of how early intervention might prevent tragedy. The red flags were there: Bud's controlling behavior, his refusal to accept separation, his growing anger. Yet, as so often happens, the signs went unheeded until it was too late. Davis's death underscored the urgent need for resources, awareness, and community vigilance in recognizing when anger threatens to turn into violence. For many, the story of Davis McClendon will always be more than a headline. It is a reminder of how quickly lives can be shattered by one person's refusal to let go. Justice may have been delivered in the courtroom, but true closure remains elusive. The memory of Davis now lives on in the hearts of those who loved him. A young life extinguished but not forgotten. A name that continues to echo in Greenwood and beyond. The story of Davis McClendon leaves us with a painful but crucial lesson. Jealousy and possessiveness, when left unchecked, can spiral into tragedy no one can ever undo. A young life, full of dreams and love, was taken away simply because someone could not let go of the past. This case is not just about one man's crime. It is a reminder for all of us that when a relationship turns toxic, ignoring the warning signs can cost lives. I'd like to hear your thoughts. In your opinion, how can we as a community better recognize the red flags before it's too late? Do you believe we can do more to protect those caught in the grip of obsession and violence? If you found this video meaningful, please leave a comment and share your perspective. I truly value hearing from you. Don't forget to hit the like button to support this channel and subscribe so you won't miss the next deep dive into true crime stories told with both detail and emotion. Your voice, your engagement, and your support are what help this channel grow and bring more important stories to light.